The sovereign collective had never been refused. That was not a boast or a piece of propaganda designed to intimidate developing civilizations before the demand arrived. It was simply a fact recorded in 60,000 years of imperial history across thousands of documented first contact events and 470 formal demand deliveries. The record was clean and consistent and unbroken, and the collective's Herald Division had long since stopped treating it as something remarkable. Remarkable implied that the alternative was possible. The alternative was not possible. The record was not remarkable. It was simply the way things were. The demand itself had been refined over tens of thousands of years until it had reached a form that the collective's communication scholars considered essentially perfect. It had one word at its core, and that word was kneel, not a metaphor, not a diplomatic abstraction, a literal instruction to acknowledge collective supremacy, surrender military authority to collective oversight, and accept whatever designated status within the collective hierarchy the assessment teams determined was appropriate for the species in question. Everything else around that central word was administrative, the formal language of the acknowledgement ceremony, the procedural steps for transferring military authority, the documentation required for designated status registration, the timeline for compliance, all of it important but secondary to the word itself, which was the only part that actually mattered. The demand worked because of what came after it if the demand was not met. The collective did not advertise the details of what came after. They did not need to. 60,000 years of expansion had left a long enough trail through galactic history that any civilization with access to historical records and the ability to cross-reference them could piece together a clear enough picture. The collective arrived. The collective demanded. Compliance followed. In the rare, early cases where compliance did not immediately follow, something happened, and then compliance followed. The details of that something were not pleasant, and they were distributed widely enough through historical channels that by the time any given civilization received a demand, they had generally already done enough research to understand that non-compliance was not a realistic option. The waiting period after demand was therefore rarely long. Most species complied within 24 hours, some within 6. A few within the first hour, their governments apparently having reached their decision before the Herald ship even finished its broadcast, prepared in advance by the research they had done on what was coming. Herald Commander Voss had been doing this work for 19 years. He was considered one of the best in the Herald Division, which was a role that rewarded patience and precision and the specific interpersonal skill of projecting absolute authority without tipping into aggression that might complicate the compliance process. You wanted the receiving civilization to understand clearly that resistance was impossible without feeling so cornered that some faction of their leadership made an irrational decision. It was a narrow channel to navigate, and Voss navigated it well. 19 deliveries, 19 compliances, a perfect record that had earned him increasingly significant assignments with increasingly developed civilizations that the collective wanted brought into compliance carefully and without incident. Earth was his 20th assignment. He had reviewed the Earth file on the transit over and found nothing unusual. A small planet orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable system. Population approximately 8 billion. Technology level classified as early spacefaring. Political structure fragmented across multiple, competing governments with no unified planetary authority. The fragmented government structure would mean coordinating compliance across multiple separate entities, which added administrative complexity, but did not change the fundamental outcome. He had handled fragmented governments before. The translation systems had prepared renderings of the demand in every major human language, 47 distinct versions covering the primary communication forms detected in Earth's broadcasts, each one verified by the linguistic analysis team for accuracy and tonal appropriateness. The collective's translation technology was the product of 60,000 years of contact with hundreds of species. It was extraordinarily good. The demand would be understood by any human who received it regardless of their native language. Voss arrived at Earth's solar system on a Wednesday morning by the calendar system Earth's largest population centers used. He positioned the Herald ship at standard broadcast range and ran through his pre-delivery checklist with the methodical thoroughness that his 19 years of perfect record had been built on. Systems verified. Translations confirmed. Broadcast range optimal. Recording systems active for compliance documentation. He gave the broadcast authorization. The demand went out on every detectable frequency simultaneously, filling every band that Earth's communication infrastructure could receive, in all 47 language versions, with a clear, flat authority of a message that had never in 60,000 years needed to be sent twice. Then Voss settled in to wait. He expected a few hours at minimum, given the fragmented government structure, probably longer. Multi-government planets needed time to establish communication between their various leadership bodies and reach some form of coordinated response, even when that response was simply the acknowledgement of a shared reality. He had brought reading material for the wait. He always brought reading material. The waiting was the least interesting part of the job. He was an hour into his reading when his communications officer indicated an incoming transmission from Earth's surface. Voss set his reading aside and checked the time elapsed since broadcast. 4 hours and 11 minutes. That was faster than he had anticipated for a fragmented government planet, but not outside the range of previous experience. Some civilizations moved quickly when properly motivated. He opened the transmission and read it. Then he read it again. The second reading produced the same result as the first, which was a sensation Voss had not experienced in 19 years of Herald service. The sensation of reading something and not knowing what to do with it. He had read compliance communications in varying formats and tones. He had read the occasional initial refusal from a government faction that had not yet understood the situation, which always resolved itself quickly once the rest of the planet's leadership weighed in. He had a large and well-organized mental catalog of human responses to overwhelming situations built from 19 years of observing species. Received news that changed their understanding of their place in the galaxy. This message did not fit anywhere in that catalog. He stood up from his station and walked to his ready room and closed the door behind him and read the message a third time on his personal display. Then a fourth, not because it was complicated. It was actually one of the clearest pieces of writing he had received in response to a demand. Short and direct and professionally structured and impossible to misread. That was the problem. He understood it perfectly. He simply did not have a category for it. He stood in his ready room with the message on his screen and the silence of a ship that was waiting for instructions from its commander and the growing awareness that this assignment was not going to resolve the way his previous 19 had resolved. He opened the emergency channel to Fleet Admiral Ron. In 19 years, he had never used the emergency channel. Emergency channels were for crises, and his deliveries did not produce crises. They produced compliance. That was the word his career had been built on. That was the word that was supposed to come next in this situation. Compliance, paperwork, documentation. Moving on to the next assignment. He pressed the channel open. "Admiral," he said. His voice was level. He was proud of how level it was given what he had spent the last 20 minutes sitting with. "We have a problem." There was a brief pause on Fleet Admiral Ron's end. "What kind of problem?" Ron asked. Voss looked at the message on his screen one more time. "The kind we have not had before," he said. Fleet Admiral Ron received Herald Commander Voss's emergency transmission in his command chamber on Collector Prime and listened to it with a particular stillness of a very senior officer who has learned over a long career that the correct response to unexpected news is always to listen completely before reacting at all. Voss was precise in his report. He described the transmission from Earth. He described its sender, a single individual rather than any governmental body. He described its content accurately and without editorializing. He transmitted the full text through the secure channel, so Ron could read it directly rather than working from a summary. Then he said something that Ron found more informative than anything else in the report. He said he did not know what category to put it in. Voss had 19 deliveries and 19 compliances, and a reputation in the Herald Division as the most capable and experienced officer in the department. If Voss did not know what category to put something in, that something was worth paying very close attention to. Ron assembled his senior staff within the hour. 7 officers who between them represented over 200 years of collective military experience in the Sovereign Collective's fleet. He gave them the full transmission text without context or framing, and asked them to read it, and then they would discuss. They read it. The room was quiet while they read. The particular quality of quiet that is different from the ordinary quiet of a professional setting, more concentrated, the quiet of people giving something more attention than they expected to need to give it. When they finished, Ron read it again himself. Not because he had not understood it the first time, because the expressions around his table told him that his senior staff had understood it the same way he had, and he wanted one more pass through the text before they talked about what that meant. The message was from Commander Linda Greer. No title beyond the rank, no governmental affiliation, no institutional header identifying which of Earth's many competing governmental bodies she represented, or whether she represented all of them, or some of them, or was speaking on her own authority. Just a rank and a name and a message that managed to be simultaneously the shortest and most consequential response to a collective demand in 60,000 years of demand history. We receive your demand. We considered it carefully. Ron noted the word carefully. It was not a filler word. It was doing specific work in that sentence, establishing that what followed was a result of deliberate thought rather than reactive emotion. Whoever Linda Greer was, she had written this message with precise attention to what each word communicated, and careful was there to tell the reader that the conclusion it preceded was not hasty. We will not be kneeling. 5 words. No qualifications. No conditional language suggesting the position might change under different circumstances, or with additional conversation, or given certain guarantees. No diplomatic softening of the kind that species sometimes use when they want to decline without appearing to decline, buying time while their governments scrambled to find a way to comply that preserved some face. Just 5 words in present tense with the flat finality of a door closing. We will not be surrendering military authority. Same construction, same tone, same complete absence of any hedge or qualification or suggestion that this position was a starting point for negotiation rather than a settled conclusion. 2 terms of the collective demand, addressed individually and declined individually with the organized precision of someone who had read the demand carefully enough to understand its structure and was responding to each element on its own terms. We are willing to discuss a relationship of mutual recognition between our civilization and yours on terms that are acceptable to both parties. This was a part that had stopped Voss and was stopping Ron now on his 3rd reading, because it was not a rejection. It was a counter-proposal. Linda Greer had declined both substantive terms of the collective demand and had immediately and in the same message proposed an alternative framework for the relationship, mutual recognition, terms acceptable to both parties. Language that implied Earth considered itself a party whose terms mattered, a party whose agreement was something the collective needed to earn rather than a subject whose compliance was something the collective was simply waiting to receive. And then the 2nd paragraph. We understand this response may prompt a military reply from your government. Ron read that sentence very carefully. It was doing several things simultaneously. It acknowledged the reality of the situation without flinching from it. It demonstrated that Linda Greer understood exactly what declining the collective demand meant in practical terms, that she had no illusions about the response her message would likely generate. It was a sentence of someone writing with clear eyes rather than hope. We want to be straightforward with you. He stopped at that phrase. Straightforward. It implied that what followed was being said directly and honestly rather than strategically. It was an unusual word choice in a document of this kind because most communications between civilizations at different power levels were inherently strategic. Every word chosen for effect rather than candor. Linda Greer was using the language of candor. Whether it was genuine or a rhetorical choice designed to create a particular impression was a question he could not answer from the text alone. We had prepared for that possibility for quite some time. There it was, the sentence that had apparently prompted Voss to use his emergency channel for the first time in 19 years. It was short and it was simply stated, and it was the most significant thing in the message. We have prepared. Past tense, indicating preparation already complete rather than currently underway. For that possibility, identifying specifically a collective military response as the thing they had prepared for quite some time, indicating that this preparation was not recent and not reactive to the demand itself, but had been ongoing before the demand arrived. She was telling them that Earth had known something like this was coming and had used the time before it came to get ready. We hope you will take that into account before making your next decision. Not a threat, a hope, the language of someone who preferred a particular outcome and was expressing that preference plainly while leaving the decision where it belonged. We remain open to conversation. Ron set the message down on the table. His senior staff were watching him with the careful attention of people waiting for a senior officer's reaction to calibrate their own. The room was still quiet. His senior tactical officer, a careful, experienced man named Gorvin, who had spent 40 years in collective fleet service and was not given to dramatizing situations, cleared his throat. "She says they are prepared for a military reply," he said. His voice was measured. He was not alarmed. He was raising the way a thorough officer raises things that require acknowledgement. "I read it," Ron said. The room was quiet for another moment. "Should we take that seriously?" Gorvin asked. The question was genuine. He was asking for an assessment, not expressing a position. Ron looked at the message on the table. He thought about 60,000 years of unbroken compliance. He thought about Voss's voice on the emergency channel, saying the kind we have not had before. He thought about the specific quality of confidence embedded in Linda Greer's 7 paragraphs, not the aggressive confidence of a species that had decided defiance was worth the cost, but the settled, confident tone of someone who had done a calculation and was comfortable with the result. He thought about quite some time. He thought about what quite some time of preparation by a species that had known a collective demand was coming might look like when the Black Armada arrived to demonstrate the consequences of declining that demand. He looked at the message one more time. Then he looked up at his senior staff. "Send the Black Armada," he said. The order to deploy the Black Armada went through collective command in less than 2 hours. That was fast by institutional standards. Major fleet deployments normally move through multiple layers of authorization, each layer adding review time and documentation requirements, and the particular friction of large organizations making large decisions carefully. The Black Armada's deployment orders required senior command authorization at the highest level, and senior command was not an institution that typically moved in under 2 hours on anything. But Ron had read Linda Greer's message and made his decision and communicated it with the flat certainty of a fleet admiral who did not want the decision debated, and the institution had responded accordingly. When the most senior officer in the collective's military structure gave a direct order, in that tone the authorization layers moved quickly. The Black Armada was not the collective's largest fleet in terms of ship count. There were larger fleets assigned to border patrol and territorial defense across the collective's vast holdings. What made the Black Armada distinct was not size but composition. Every vessel in it had been selected through a process that took years and applied criteria that went beyond the standard military assessment metrics. Hull integrity ratings above the fleet average, weapon systems representing current generation technology rather than the previous generation equipment that filled out most of the collective's standard fleet assignments, crew qualification scores in the top percentile across every relevant category, and the commanders. The Black Armada's captains were not simply senior officers with long service records. They were officers who had demonstrated in real operational conditions the specific combination of technical competence and judgment under pressure that the Armada Selection Board looked for. Officers who had been tested and had not found wanting. Officers who understood that the Armada's reputation was not separate from their own performance, but was built from it, maintained by it, dependent on it in every engagement. 200 ships crewed by the best people collective had produced in 60,000 years of military development. The reputation was real because it had been earned repeatedly across hundreds of operations, and it was currently maintained because the civilizations the Armada had demonstrated against still existed as cautionary examples visible to anyone researching what happened when you declined the collective demand. 3 species had complied with the demand before the Herald ship finished broadcasting simply because they had done their research and reached the correct conclusion without needing a demonstration. That was the Armada doing its job without moving. Presence as deterrence. History as argument. Captain Dean Holloway had served in the Black Armada for 20 years and had commanded the 7th Wing for the last 6. He was 53 years old, lean and methodical, the kind of officer who made decisions carefully and then committed to them completely, and who had built a command style around the principle that preparation eliminated most of the situations that required improvisation. His wing had participated in 4 demonstrations during his tenure as commander. All 4 had gone the same way. The Armada arrived. It took up its formation positions. The sweep data confirmed what the intelligence files had predicted about the target civilization's defensive capability. The broadcast was prepared. The target civilization looked at what had appeared in their sky and began compliance communications, sometimes before the broadcast even went out. The visual confirmation of the Armada's presence being sufficient to complete the calculation their governments had been doing since the Herald ship arrived. Clean, consistent, entirely predictable. Dean had participated in enough of them that the pattern felt less like a series of separate events and more like a single event that kept recurring with minor variations. You showed up. The other side looked at what you had brought. They complied. You documented the compliance and departed. The variation was in the details, different species, different system configurations, different timelines for compliance communications to arrive, but the fundamental shape was always the same. He expected Earth to follow the same shape. The transit from Collective Prime to Earth's solar system took 6 days. The Armada traveled in compressed formation it would maintain through the deployment. 200 ships moving as a coordinated unit. The kind of formation that required constant adjustment and communication between vessels, and that the Armada's crews maintained with the practiced ease of long experience. 6 days of formation travel was routine. The crews ran their standard drills and system checks and the low-level maintenance that kept ships at operational readiness, and Dean held his standard briefings and reviewed his operational plan and did the quiet professional work of a commander preparing for something he expected to be straightforward. On the 6th day, the Armada reached the transit emergence point at the edge of Earth's solar system and dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 200 ships emerging from transit in formation was a coordinated event that required precise timing across the entire fleet, and the Armada executed it with the smoothness of a unit that had done it hundreds of times. Dean watched the formation complete itself on his tactical display, each vessel appearing in its designated position. The whole structure assembling itself in the dark at the edge of the target system with the unhurried precision of something that did not need to rush. He felt the weight of it the way he always felt it at this moment. 200 ships behind him. The best fleet in the known galaxy in position and ready. The familiar, settled confidence of someone who understood exactly what they had brought to a situation and had no uncertainty about whether it was sufficient. He ordered the full sweep. Standard pre-demonstration protocol. You confirmed your intelligence picture before proceeding. You verified the target system's configuration, identified any defensive assets, confirmed the location of the primary population centers that would be the focus of the broadcast. It took 20 minutes, and it always confirmed what the files already showed because the collective's intelligence on target systems was thorough and the sweep was a formality. He used the 20 minutes to review the broadcast package his communications team had prepared. The formal demand for compliance, the timeline, the documentation of what the Black Armada represented in terms of military capability, the historical record of previous demonstrations included as reference material for any human government that needed the information made explicit. Everything was in order. He approved it and set it aside for transmission after the sweep completed. Sensor Officer Wren ran the sweep with her team, and Dean watched the data build on the system display as the sensors mapped Earth's solar system in increasing detail. Planets, moons, asteroid concentrations, the infrastructure of a developing civilization in the inner system. Then more infrastructure. Then considerably more infrastructure than the intelligence file had suggested should be there. Then numbers that Wren looked at once, and then looked at again, and then ran the verification process on before she said anything, because she was the kind of officer who confirmed things before reporting them, and confirmation was taking longer than it should have because the verification was coming back the same way the initial reading had come back, and she needed a moment to accept that the instruments were working correctly and the data was accurate. "Captain," she said. Her voice had a quality Dean had not heard from her in 12 years of working together. Careful in a new way. The careful of someone managing something they had not expected to be managing. Full sweep results are in. Dean turned from the broadcast package. Wren was not composed in her normal way. She was composed in a deliberate way. The way you are composed when composure is something you are actively maintaining rather than your natural state. Her hands were on her console. Her posture was correct. Her expression was controlled. "Talk to me, Wren," he said. She met his eyes. "You need to see the numbers yourself, sir." He crossed the bridge to her station without hurrying, because hurrying communicated something to the bridge crew that he was not ready to communicate. He positioned himself in front of her display and looked at what the sweep had returned. He looked at the distribution of objects across the system. He looked at the power signatures. He looked at the positioning of things that should not have been there given the intelligence file's assessment of Earth's technological capability, and that were absolutely there confirmed on every independent sensor array the ship had. He looked at the numbers that described what those things were capable of. He stood at Wren's station for a long time. The bridge was quiet around him. His crew was professional enough to keep working at their stations and not professional enough to fully hide the fact that they were paying close attention to what their captain was doing at the sensor station and what his face was doing while he did it. He straightened up. He thought about Linda Greer's message. We have prepared for that possibility for quite some time. He thought about the word quite and the word some and the word time and what those words look like when you translated them into the numbers currently on Wren's display. He understood now what quite some time looked like. Hold position, he said quietly. Wren nodded once. She had been waiting for those words, and the relief of hearing them was visible briefly before her professional composure reasserted itself. The order went to the fleet on the standard command channel. Hold position. No advance. No broadcast. No movement toward the inner system. Across 200 ships, the sweep data was arriving on 200 sensor displays and being read by 200 sensor officers and reaching 200 captains through 200 different conversations that all ended in the same place. The same two words. The same order. Nobody in the Black Armada advanced. The most feared fleet in the known galaxy sat at the edge of Earth's solar system in perfect formation and held its position, and the silence on the command channels between ships had a quality that Dean Holloway had never heard in 20 years of Black Armada service. It was the silence of 200 experienced officers sitting with the same information and reaching the same conclusion, and not yet being ready to say out loud what that conclusion was. Ray Foster had grown up with the Black Armada, the way some children grew up with religion, not as an abstract concept or a distant institution, but as something present and alive in a household, discussed at dinner and referenced in conversation, and held up as a concrete example of what military service meant at its highest level. His father had served in it for 30 years. His grandfather had served in the fleet that preceded it before the Armada took its current form. The history of the Black Armada was threaded through Ray's family history in a way that made the two things difficult to separate. He had heard the stories before he was old enough to fully understand them. The campaigns, the demonstrations, the record that stretched back across 60,000 years of collective expansion without a single failure, without a single instance of civilization that had looked at what the Armada brought to the system and decided that resistance was a viable response. He had grown up understanding the Armada not as one military force among others, but as a ceiling of what military force could be, the absolute upper limit, the thing beyond which nothing existed because nothing needed to exist beyond it. He had joined at 18 because what else do you do when you have grown up inside that story? 10 years of service had taken him from basic training through increasingly responsible postings to his current position as a junior captain in the Black Armada's 14th Wing. He was 29 years old, and he was exactly where he had always planned to be, and the plan had always made sense because the Armada was what it was, and being part it meant being part of something that the galaxy had spent 60,000 years confirming was unmatched. He had never had a reason to question that. He was questioning it now. The sweep data had arrived on his display 40 minutes after the Armada took up its formation position at the edge of Earth's solar system, and Ray had read it with a focused attention he brought to all operational data and had then read it again with a different quality of attention, the attention of someone who has found something that does not fit, and is checking their own reading before concluding that the data is correct and their previous understanding is what needs adjusting. The Earth file had been distributed to all Armada captains during the transit. Standard intelligence briefing, the kind that preceded every demonstration, covering the target civilization's technology level and defensive capability and population distribution and political structure. Ray had read it on day 2 of the transit and filed it in his operational preparation with the straightforward confidence of someone briefing on a situation that was going to proceed predictably. The sweep data and the Earth file were not describing the same solar system, not in minor ways, not in the way that intelligence assessments were always slightly incomplete, because no assessment was ever perfectly current. The discrepancy was large enough that Ray had run the comparison 3 times looking for the error and had not found the error because there was no error. The instruments were working correctly. The data was accurate. The gap between what the file described and what the sweep showed was not a measurement problem. It was a reality problem. The file described a developing civilization with early spaceflight capability and limited orbital infrastructure. The sweep showed a solar system that had been systematically and deliberately prepared by someone who had known a significant military threat was coming and had used the available time to build a response to it. The installations were not clustered in the naive pattern of early space development. Everything orbiting close to the home planet because the technology and resources to go further had not yet been developed. They were distributed, positioned, located at points in the system that is tactical training recognized as chosen rather than incidental. The locations you chose when you were building a defensive network rather than simply placing things where early space capability could reach. Someone had looked at the geometry of their solar system and thought about it militarily. Someone had been thinking about it militarily for quite some time. Ray sat with the sweep data for a while before the visual contact came through on the long-range optical systems and added a different layer to what the numbers had already told him. He looked at his view screen. He was quiet for a full minute. What was out there in the outer system was not the scrambled emergency defense of a civilization that had received a demand and panicked into activity. Panic produced different results. Panic moved things quickly and carelessly into whatever positions were reachable, activated whatever existed without strategic coordination, generated the visible signature of institutions operating under maximum stress in minimum time. What Ray was looking at did not have that signature. It had the signature of preparation, of planning conducted carefully over a long period by people who were not panicking because they had anticipated this moment and had done what they needed to do before it arrived. The positioning was deliberate. The distribution was deliberate. The whole picture was deliberate in a way that said these decisions were made by someone who understood the problem clearly and had taken the time to think through the solution before implementing it. They had known the Black Armada was coming. Not specifically the Black Armada, perhaps, but military response. They had understood that declining the collective demand meant a military response would follow, and they had treated that not as a catastrophe to be avoided, but as a planning parameter to be addressed. Commander Linda Greer had said quite some time in her message, and Ray was now looking at what quite some time in preparation looked like when translated from words into physical reality. It looked like this. His communications officer broke the silence carefully. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the planet." Ray straightened in his chair. Whatever he had been expecting about this operation, whatever the transit briefings and the Armada's history and 10 years of service had prepared him for, none of it had fully prepared him for this moment, but the training was still there. And the training said you received transmissions, and you assessed them, and you responded professionally. On screen, he said, the face that appeared was a woman. She was somewhere in her 40s, brown hair, the kind of face that had settled into its final form and was comfortable there. She was wearing a plain dark uniform, and the only decoration on it was a small patch on the left shoulder, a blue planet with a single moon, simple and unadorned. She was sitting at what appeared to be a standard command station, and she was looking at the screen with the relaxed, attentive expression of someone who's been expecting a call and is ready for it. Not nervous, not performing composure over nervousness the way people do when they are frightened, but disciplined, genuinely settled. The settled quality of someone who is in a situation they have thought about extensively and is not surprised by any part of it. "This is Commander Linda Greer," she said. Her voice was pleasant in the specific way that people are pleasant when they are not performing pleasantness, but are simply in a reasonable mood because the situation is developing as they anticipated. "I believe we have some things to discuss." Ray looked at her. He thought about the sweep data behind him on his display. He thought about the positioning he had observed and the preparation it represented, and quite some time it had taken to build what was out there in Earth's solar system. He thought about the message she had sent in response to collective demand, the calm professional language of it, the counter-proposal attached to the refusals, the straightforward acknowledgement that a military response was likely followed by the quiet confidence of someone who prepared for that likelihood. He looked at her face, and he looked at the sensor data, and he put those two things together. He thought about the ceiling. He had grown up believing in the ceiling, the absolute upper limit of military capability that the Black Armada represented, the thing beyond which nothing existed. He had never questioned it because it had never needed questioning. 60,000 years of history had confirmed it continuously, and he had inherited that confirmation along with his father's stories and his grandfather's service record and the whole family framework that the Armada was built into. The ceiling was still there. He was just not certain anymore that the Black Armada was the only thing touching it. "Commander Greer," he said. His voice came out steady, and he was genuinely pleased about that given what was currently happening in his understanding of the universe. "Captain Ray Foster, I think you're right." She nodded once, the nod of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. "Good," she said simply. "Let's start there." The Black Armada held position for 8 hours. 8 hours was a long time for 200 warships to sit in formation at the edge of a target system doing nothing. Formations were designed for movement and action, and the sustained stillness of the whole position order created a particular kind of tension across the fleet, not the tension of imminent conflict, but the tension of waiting without knowing what you were waiting for, of 200 crews at their stations watching their screens and running their systems and understanding that something unusual was happening without having the full picture of what it was. The full picture was being assembled in a conversation. Commander Linda Greer had opened the channel from Earth's end, and Captain Ray Foster had accepted it from his bridge, and what followed over the next several hours was something that neither the Sovereign Collective nor humanity had a precise template for, because it had not happened before, not in this form, not with this specific quality. Every previous contact between the Collective and a new civilization had followed the same structure. The Collective spoke. The other civilization responded. The response was either compliance or something that quickly became compliance after the appropriate demonstration was applied. The structure was vertical by design, one party with authority, and one party subject to that authority, and every element of the contact protocol reinforced the vertical structure from the first broadcast of the demand to the final documentation of compliance. What happened on that channel for 8 hours was horizontal. 2 people talking, not one person issuing and one person receiving. 2 people with information the other needed. 2 people with perspectives worth hearing. 2 people who had looked at the same situation from opposite sides and reached conclusions that were different in their details, but aligned in their fundamental recognition of what the situation actually was. Linda Greer was not what Ray had expected. He had spent the first few minutes of the conversation half waiting for performance to crack, for the calm professionalism to reveal itself as a brittle surface over something more desperate underneath, for the confidence to show, it seems, when the conversation moved into areas that tested it. He had been in enough negotiations and difficult conversations to know that confidence projected from a position of genuine strength felt different from confidence constructed as a tactical choice, and he had been trying to determine which kind he was dealing with. The longer the conversation went, the clearer the answer became. Linda Greer knew exactly what was in Earth's solar system and exactly what it was capable of because she had been part of building it. Not alone, not quickly. Over years of coordinated work by an organization that had understood long before the Herald ship arrived that Earth's development trajectory was going to intersect eventually with the Collective's expansion pattern, and had decided to treat that intersection as a planning problem rather than an existential threat. She told him this plainly. She did not make it sound more dramatic than it was. She described the timeline of preparation, the decisions that had been made and why, the assessment of what a collective military response would look like, and what would be needed to meet it on terms that made the response not worth completing. She spoke about it with the straightforward clarity of someone describing work they had done carefully and were comfortable standing behind. Ray asked questions, and she answered them, and he asked follow-up questions, and she answered those too, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd hour, he stopped trying to find a crack in the confidence and started simply listening, because what she was telling him was accurate and complete and did not require any cracks to be found because it was not a performance. He told her things too, not classified operational information, but honest things about what the sweep data had shown the Armada captains and what the effect of that data had been, about holding position, about the conversations that had been happening on command channels between ships in the hours since the sweep results came in, about his own process of sitting with what he was looking at and revising the framework he had been operating inside, since he was old enough to understand the framework. She listened the way she talked, fully and without performing the listening. 8 hours. When the channel closed, Ray sat at his station for a while, before moving to his ready room to write his report. He had filed hundreds of operational reports in 10 years of service, and he had always approached them with the same professional standard, accurate and complete, and organized in the format that the collective's reporting structure required. This report was harder to write than any of the others, not because he did not know what to say. He knew exactly what to say. The difficulty was that what he needed to say was going to land in Fleet Admiral Ron's command chamber like something that had no precedent in the reporting history of the Black Armada, and he needed to say it clearly enough that its implications were unmistakable without overstating anything or adding weight that the facts did not themselves carry. He described the sweep data, accurately and in full, every significant reading, the positioning he had observed, the analysis of what the distribution and capability of Earth's system assets indicated about the preparation that had preceded the Armada's arrival. He let the data speak for most of that section because the data was more persuasive than any framing he could put around it. He described his conversation with Commander Greer, the quality of her confidence, and what 8 hours of direct conversation had revealed about what that confidence was based on, the substance of what she had told him about the timeline, and the preparation, and the decision-making that had produced what the sweep data showed. Then he wrote his assessment. It was not long. He did not need many words, because the situation did not benefit from more words. He wrote that the Black Armada had arrived at a system that was prepared to receive it in a way that changed the operational calculus of the demonstration. He wrote that proceeding with the demonstration under current conditions would not produce the compliance outcome the demonstration was designed to achieve. He wrote that Commander Greer's original message had proposed a framework that deserved serious consideration by collective high command. Then he wrote his recommendation, withdrawal and negotiation. He sent the report before he could revise it into something more cautious, because caution would make it less accurate, and accuracy was what the situation required even when accuracy was uncomfortable. The Black Armada withdrew 4 hours after Ray's report reached Fleet Admiral Ron. The withdrawal was orderly and professional, and conducted in the same careful formation the fleet had maintained since arrival. 200 warships turning and accelerating, and jumping to faster-than-light travel in sequence. The whole movement executed with the Black Armada's characteristic precision. No communication accompanied the withdrawal. No broadcast to Earth explaining the departure. No final transmission. They simply left. The collective's high command emergency session was convened within hours of the withdrawal confirmation reaching collective prime, 14 hours behind closed doors. The session had no official record distributed to the wider collective administrative apparatus afterward, which was itself a significant departure from normal institutional practice. What happened in those 14 hours stayed in that room and filtered out only in its result, which was a formal communication drafted by the session chair and transmitted to Earth through the same channels that had carried the original demand. The communication acknowledged receipt of Commander Linda Greer's original message. It expressed the collective's interest in discussing terms of mutual recognition. Mutual recognition. Her phrase, returned to her unchanged, which was its own kind of statement from an institution that had spent 60,000 years never using that phrase, because it had never had occasion to. Admiral Webb read the collective's communication in her office at Earth's Unified Defense Command on a Thursday afternoon, which felt appropriate given that the original demand had arrived on a Wednesday, and the whole business had turned in the space of a week into something that was going to take considerably longer than a week to fully process. Lieutenant Carl Price stood beside her desk and waited while she read. He was young Carl, 24 years old, and recently assigned to the Admiral's staff, still in the part of his career where remarkable things felt remarkable rather than simply like the texture of the job. He had been in this office for most of the last 8 hours watching pieces of the situation arrive and watching the Admiral process them, and he understood that what was in that communication was significant even before she set it down. She set it down. She looked at it on her desk for a moment. Then she looked at Carl with the expression of a person who has been working towards something for a long time and has just received confirmation that the work produced the intended result. Well, she said simply, about time. Carl looked at the communication. 60,000 years of collective expansion. 470 civilizations. The demand that had never been refused until a week ago when a single officer had sat down and written 7 paragraphs in plain language and signed her name at the bottom. What happens now? He asked. Webb leaned back in her chair and looked out the window behind her desk. An ordinary sky over an ordinary city on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The kind of afternoon that did not look different from the outside, despite being the afternoon that everything had shifted. She thought about Linda Greer's 8-hour conversation with Collective Captain, who had grown up believing in a ceiling, and had spent those 8 hours revising his understanding of where the ceiling was. She thought about quite some time of preparation, and what it had been for. She thought about 200 ships sitting in formation, and then turning around, and the 14 hours of closed doors that had followed. She thought about mutual recognition. "Now," she said, "we talk?" Carl nodded slowly. Outside the window, the ordinary afternoon continued its ordinary business. Traffic and light, and people moving through their days on a planet that had just declined to kneel and had been right about what that meant, and was now sitting across the table from 60,000 years of unchallenged power with something to say. The talking was going to take a while. That was fine. They had prepared for this too.